He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with coming up on 30 years of experience. Together, Henry and I are the Brief Brothers. We love talking about advertising, creative briefs, and briefing. Henry, we have another episode, and today an old friend, a foundational figure in our industry, Jon Steel, is back to have a great conversation with us about briefs and briefing. That's our topic. Let's join the conversation.
Let's.
Henry, we are back with another episode of the Brief Brothers, and I'm delighted to say we have an old friend who is returning, the name of Jon Steel. He is one of the founding fathers of modern strategy, not just in title, but in philosophy. Jon Steel is the author of the seminal book, Truth, Lies, and Advertising, a text that many of us still keep within arm's reach, probably dog-eared and underlined and quietly revered. He's the Brit who brought account planning across the Atlantic, building the discipline from scratch at Goodby, Silverstein and Partners. His insights helped launch campaigns like Got Milk, and his influence is baked into generations of strategy culture. Tonight, Jon returns to the Brief Brothers to look back at where strategy's been, where it's headed, and how we can all do it a little bit more truthfully. Jon, Henry, and I are really excited to have you back. Welcome to the Brief Brothers.
Thank you very much for having me back. I don't get invited back for a second time very often.
Well, I think
there's no sacred cows here. So if you wanted to gore some, we'd be more than happy to indulge you.
Absolutely. And I want to kind of break the ice by asking this really tough question of you, Jon. Which do you think requires more strategy? Account planning or cricket?
I think cricket without a doubt. But with your American viewers and listeners, I don't think we'll go there.
But I wanted to give you the chance because I know that you have a fondness for the game.
I do have a fondness for the game, yes. Was very fond of it before I moved to the United States. Was not able to watch it for 10 years while I lived there, but have reconnected with the game since. And my son plays professionally, so I have a deep personal interest in it, as well as a sort of a sports fan's interest.
Okay, well, yes, that is, you do have a vested interest in that. I want to go back and talk about your roots. Now, most people who follow our industry and know your role in our industry know that you started your career in the United Kingdom and you worked for some of the big names. And I'm curious to know, what do you suppose that Stephen King or Stanley Pollock would say about strategy today?
Well, I didn't work with either man. I worked initially at Bose Massimi Pollitt, which was the agency that Stanley co-founded. And he'd already passed by the time that I joined, which was in 1984. I subsequently did quite a lot of work for J. Walter Thompson, for which agency Stephen had established the account planning discipline at about the same time that Stanley did at BMP. The circumstances of the time were such that the industry had become terribly reliant on data. Does that sound familiar? It's a cyclical thing. And a lot of decisions were being made on the grounds of information that in Stephen's place at JWT in Berkeley Square and Stanley's in Paddington seemed very wrong to both of them. And they set about independently, entirely separate from each other, setting up a system that would provide more relevant information to the people who really needed it at the time they needed it, to develop campaigns that would actually connect with people, the people they were trying to engage and influence. And it was always said that there were two very different styles of account planning in those agencies, that the BMP's, I suppose, was more qualitative and JWT's was more quantitative by nature. I'm not sure in reality whether there was that much difference, because I think the really good planners or strategists, whatever you want to call them, they called them planners then, the really good planners worked in pretty much the same way and were able to contribute equally, whether they worked for BMP or JWT. And there was a phrase used in London in the 70s to describe the difference between the departments, that JWT was an agency of grand strategy, whereas BMP were creative tweakers. And I've always thought that planning needed both. You needed the big strategic idea, and then you needed to tweak execution to make sure that it really brought that to life in a distinctive and relevant way. Now, I suspect that both Stanley Pollitt and Stephen King would be fairly dissatisfied with what they see, both strategically and creatively these days. And I also believe you can't separate strategy from creativity. And you know, I've always said to people who work for me that until you've got a creative idea, you don't have a strategy. And the two have to walk hand in hand, because the best strategy in the world will fail if it's not executed properly, and great execution will fail if it's not built on the right strategic foundation. So the two have to go together, and that's why I've always used a process that I suppose develops strategy and creative ideas in parallel, feeding back and forth between the two until they meet. It seems to me that the agency world has sort of absolved itself of a lot of the responsibility for strategy these days, proper strategy. It's reliant on data, it's reliant on technology, it's reliant on a lot of things other than humanity and common sense and creativity. All of those things seem to me absent in most of the work that I see on a day-to-day basis. I live in Western Australia, where the standard of advertising is very poor anyway. But I've spent quite a lot of time recently in the US and the UK, and I've not seen anything in either of those countries that's made me revise my opinion on the state of the industry, put it that way.
In an episode that hasn't come out yet, Henry and I had a conversation about some ideas put forth by a strategist you may have heard of, Mark Pollard. He's a global vagabond and travels the world training mid-level to senior level strategists. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we talked about, and the episode will be coming out this week, but one of the things that we talked about, and Henry had some strong thoughts on it, was Mark said, you have to understand the difference between an honest and a dishonest strategy and an honest and dishonest creative brief. And he went to great lengths to describe what he meant by an honest creative brief and an honest strategy, and the foundation of which, and Henry, help me out here if my memory starts to fail me. But essentially what he was saying is, don't pull your punches. Come right out and say what it is that you know about your brand, and don't use jargon. Say what you know.
Whitewashing the warts that the client's brand or product might have, things like that.
Yes.
Use those things to the advantage. Let the creatives find ways to use those things. And of course, a dishonest brief would be the opposite of that. Any thoughts on that way of thinking?
I think he's absolutely right. All good communication is based on truth. It's based on a human truth. It's based on a cultural truth, and it's based on the truth of what the brand can promise and does promise. And the whole craft of the strategist is understanding those three different things and bringing them together. And insight exists at the confluence of a human truth and a cultural truth and a brand promise. And it's up to you, if one of them doesn't exist, to create it and find those connections and find a relationship between the three that can be truly catalytic, but it has to be based on truth. I know, when I think we talked about Porsche before when we spoke, that strategy was based on a fundamental truth about the Porsche brand that nobody at Porsche would acknowledge and had acknowledged in years, which was that people who didn't drive Porsches thought that people who did were pricks. And you had to understand that, and you had to recognize it, and you had to embrace it if you were going to do anything to help that brand. You could talk about engineering and design and tradition up the wazoo. It didn't make any difference. The fact is that Porsche drivers were roundly disliked, and their communication had to address what we came to term the asshole factor. If you didn't find a way to have people like the brand more, it didn't have a future. So I agree entirely with what Mark said. There are honest briefs, and a lot of briefs, as you know, are written for the client's benefit. They're not written for creative people. They're written for the planner to show off how much they know, how much work they've done, how smart they are, and to blow smoke up the client's arse. I'm sure.
Well, Henry, with the exception of Henry, of course, he never would do anything like that.
But present company accepted. But there should almost always be things in a brief that are going to make the client uncomfortable, because in the end, that's what you're there for. You're there to act as an interpreter between a client who has their own way of thinking about the world and a person in the real world who, in most cases, thinks entirely differently. Who views their brand, who views their category entirely different. They work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on toilet paper. So this toilet paper accounts for a disproportionate amount of time in their life that they spend thinking about it and caring about it. Most people in the real world don't. And
I'm glad
keep it real.
I'm glad you mentioned the client, because I was going to chime in earlier when you were talking about the role data was taking and agencies vacating the strategy space. I was also going to say, I think, and I've only been in the business since the mid 90s. But I believe, based on what I know from before or what I've learned about the history, is that the clients have taken it upon themselves to interject in the world of strategy in communications a lot more than they used to. They write their own briefs and they give them to the agency and so forth. So I think that's also part of it. And as a strategist, I see one of my roles is running interference in that, trying not to let that contaminate too much what I'm telling the creatives. Like I take the client's brief on board along with everything else that I'm learning about the brand or the product and the assignment, and synthesizing it in a way that I help our creatives and excluding. And we talk a lot about, briefs here. And to me, it's really at its core, it's reductionism, right? Like it's getting to the heart of it and stripping away all the other bullshit. And so I unfortunately, I think you're right. Clients tend to get a little myopic about their business, whether it's toilet paper or breakfast cereal or whatever. And that ends up with a really distorted view of what they think consumers see in their brands and in their products.
And you have to take them on the journey. I mean, as a planner, I always had three constituencies. I had the client, I had my creative partners, and I had people in the real world, who, on a very broad spectrum, people who had a relationship with the brand, didn't have a relationship with the brand, might have a relationship with the brand. And I had to take all of them into account. And the best clients I worked with were always very, very good sources of relevant information. They knew their brand and their category inside and out, and they knew it better than I did. Now, in some cases, it made them myopic about it, there were some nightmare scenarios where a client would come to me and my agency and say, right, McKinsey have been working on this for the last 9 months. Here's the answer. Go and execute it. And it quite clearly wasn't the answer. I mean, they'd identified what the problem was, but they didn't really have the ability to identify a decent solution. But I also had clients who came in with very good ideas, and I always thought it was the client's responsibility to give you some direction of where they thought the answer might lie, but they have to be open-minded enough to accept if they're wrong. Now, again, I think we talked a little bit last time about the Got Milk campaign that I worked on at Goodby. That started with the client saying, right, I want you to do this campaign, and by the way, I've got an idea. And you could hear and see the eyes rolling in the back of the room. And he said, my idea, and he said, I've worked on a lot of commodities over the years, and I've looked at milk from the outside and said that, and this comes back to the point about honesty. The honest truth about milk is not that people use it thinking about calcium and vitamins and protein and all that good for your bones and all that sort of stuff. They think about milk on two occasions. They think about it when they've got a chocolate chip cookie or a bowl of cereal poured out or a brownie or a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And he said, I think milk, it's milk and there's always something else with milk. It's very rarely consumed alone, which is true. And meanwhile, the industry did all of its research saying, how many glasses of milk do you consume a week? So they miss like 70% of 80% of the consumption by asking that irrelevant question. So he said, my idea is milk, and let's do a campaign about companion foods. And we, sorry?
I was just going to say I'm sorry to step on you. Go ahead.
No, I'll be quick, but his idea was about companion foods, and we came back and said, we think that's like half a good idea. But actually it should be the other way around. It's something and milk, because the something's always more interesting than the milk, right? You don't pour yourself a bowl of milk and then think, what shall I put in it?
Unless you're Buddy Ebsen and you play a detective on TV, and I forget what was it, Matlock? I forget the name of it. But...
Okay, well, I'm glad to know there's an exception to that rule. But he said it's milk and something. We said it's something and milk. And then later on, as we developed our research, we actually realized that it was the thing that was really powerful and could get people to actually do something was the something and no milk. Because really, honestly, the only time you think about milk and that you care about it is when you need it and you haven't got any.
Yeah, yeah.
That all started with the client's idea. Without that idea, maybe we wouldn't have got to it. But he had the idea, we improved upon it, and then we found something better. And he was smart enough to have the idea, but also open enough to say, yeah, fair cop, I was half right, but half wrong,
So two quick points on that, and one is what I was going to say before and interrupted you, was that the idea itself, the brilliance of it is like a psychological deprivation exercise, right? Like where you're giving the stimulus and you're showing the person about to enjoy this thing and then they can't. And so it's a little bit like the Whopper freak out from Burger King from years ago, where people go into the restaurant and they give them like a Wendy's burger or a Big Mac and they're like, what the hell is this?
Yeah.
Right. But it's, obviously a different scenario. So I've always thought that was brilliant, and I think it's one of the core like strategies for like products that are ubiquitous that we use all the time. We don't necessarily appreciate them, but when they're missing, that there's something for sure that's there. And the other thing was your anecdote to me brings up another topic which comes up here a lot, which is the dreaded bell curve, right? Like, so yeah, there are terrible clients that want to impose their will and be very prescriptive on creative and are very myopic. But then there are some that are very insightful. They know their business, they're smart, they know an agency can help them if they give them the right direction. Just like there are good strategists and brief writers, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
So that, it's one of those things. Like, I think we all as humans tend to fall into the, well, strategy is crap now. Well, probably there were a lot of bad strategists back then too. I think there's always a bell curve of distribution. There's some people that are
Yeah.
outstanding, a lot of them that are acceptable, and some that just shouldn't be near a creative brief or a creative team. Same thing with creatives, same thing with clients, you name it.
But to go back to the original question that Howard asked about what Stephen King and Stanley Pollitt would say about strategy today, the way that we got to our deprivation strategy for milk, was by going out and doing qualitative research with people who we had asked to go without milk for a week before they came to our research. We had a theory, a hypothesis that no milk was maybe where the sweet spot lay, and we thought, well, let's try it out. And we asked people not to use milk for a week and to keep a diary during that week of what they'd eaten and what they'd had to drink and how they were feeling. And there were a lot of interesting anecdotes came out of that people just quite spontaneously related it back to all the times that they'd run out of milk and how terrible that was, and how somebody's now got to go out, and who the hell is it who put the empty carton back in the fridge. And that moment when you take the carton out of the fridge and it feels lighter than you'd imagined, and you shake it as if magically that's going to put more milk back into the carton. It was rich area, and people were engaged and leaning forward and sort of having fun and putting their own ideas in, and you just saw this idea developing before your eyes. Now, I think one of the problems with strategy today is that not enough strategists are getting out into the real world and talking to real people. They're Google planners. They're sitting there at a laptop processing data and doing online surveys, and they're not
Chat
actually,
GPT strategists.
yeah, and they're not going out and talking to the people they need to be meeting. Because I would say in all the years that I did this job, the single most useful stimulus for anything I did was qualitative research, and that could be informal conversations with people in bars or grocery stores, or formal focus groups, which are much maligned these days. They're not reliable. They don't need to be reliable. You just need one person in one group to say one thing, which is like the guy in my Porsche group who in a thought bubble I'd given him above a car that he's sitting next to at a stoplight. I asked him in his imagination, "You're looking at that guy in the Porsche. What are you thinking?" And he wrote the word asshole in the thought bubble. Everybody else said, "Oh my God, that's what we wanted to say." But we thought, "Oh, you're paying us to be sort of professional and intelligent and sensible." But that was the strategy right there. One word from one person in one focus group. Never mind the others. Never mind the other 10 focus groups you've done. Never mind the 50 interviews. It's not
the double blind analysis. It's that one thing. You don't have to have that serious kind of research. We had Sarah Walker Hall on. She was the author of a brief for the Richards Group in Dallas 20 years ago, a little packaged goods product called Kiwi Shoe Polish. And she won an award for her strategy and the brief and the creative that came out of the campaign, as won awards. And it's still up on the walls 20 years later at the office in Dallas. And she told the story of having spent 8 hours writing a draft of the brief, and she just didn't like it. Something was missing. She went out to the local mall in Dallas with her camera. This is 20 years ago. And started taking pictures of men, asking if she could be allowed to take pictures of them in their shoes, in their weekend shoes. And they almost to a person said, no, these are just my beat around shoes. These aren't really, they're ugly. They're not, I have much nicer shoes that I wear during the week. And they were embarrassed. by what they were wearing and didn't want her to take pictures. And that gave her the idea to go back and rewrite her brief that produced this campaign. So here's an example of an intrepid. Here's an example of an intrepid strategist. You know, we've also told, I love to tell the story of the Capodastro bar, which I won't tell again. That's about an intrepid creative who didn't like all the information that was given to him or to his team. So what you're talking about is intrepidity. It's like, I want to get that one piece of information. So I want to go back to the question we were addressing earlier, and the point that you were making about seeking that human truth. Given today's, well, what some critics call, we're in a post-truth culture, or truthiness, whatever you want to call it, and meaning it's hard to get to this truth. In a fractured culture, do you see this quest for truth as still as important or as viable, attainable?
Of course. I mean, if I didn't think that quest for truth were attainable, what's the point in living? I mean, there's a lot of people prominent people, shall we say, who twist the truth, you know, for their own ends. The truth is still there. Humans are still humans. They're not going to have changed that much in the last 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. And I still have great faith in human nature, and I have great faith in the things that make great ideas great, that make great books great, that make great movies great, that make for enduring relationships, and they're all based on truth. And that's not gone away. It may not be as fashionable, and certain people may have made falsehoods more attractive, but that doesn't mean humanity's changed.
You've said in the past that the hardest copywriting or writing job at an agency is writing the brief. Do you still agree with that statement?
It's probably well, as a strategist, when you're writing the brief, it's probably the most important thing you'll do in the course of your work. But I think writing the brief is only a small part of the briefing process. And I often used to write the brief after we had the idea, because the way that I approached it was to go to my creative partners and say, okay, I've been thinking about this for a while. I've got a half-assed idea. Here it is. What do you think? And then we'd work on it together. And again, we'd arrive at a meeting, you know, to be a place where we'd meet, and get excited about an idea, and then I'd sort of craft the brief around that. But
didn't Sir John Haggerty essentially say, if I don't get a good brief, I will create one myself? So it's
well, yeah, but all good creative people will. But John Haggerty also said, and he said this at a conference I was at where he was speaking. Somebody asked him how he recognizes a great brief, and he said, well, it's a brief that boils down to an idea, a proposition, whatever you call it in your agency, that I can write on a sheet of paper, draw a picture of the product next to it, and say to myself, right, that's the first ad. Now it's my job as creative director to write a better one.
My favorite story. Love to tell that story.
And I've always encouraged my planners to sort of boil the brief down to a poster, a billboard, because I think unless your idea works that immediately in about 7 words and a visual, it doesn't work. So postcard strategy, back of postage stamp strategy, and it doesn't have to be great. It just has to sort of take the creative people in the right direction. So I remember a brief that one of my planners, still works at Goodby, Kelly Evans Pfeiffer, wrote for Polaroid, which was, with Polaroid, the picture's just the beginning. Don't think of it as a camera. Think of it as a tool to get things done. You take a picture and you've got it immediately. And this is in the days before digital photography.
Right. right.
And frankly, Polaroid pictures were pretty shitty looking pictures compared to what you get off a 35mm camera. So competing with 35mm cameras was stupid, really. But every household should have a Polaroid camera around for when there's that leak under your sink, and you've got to take a picture of the U-bend to then take to the store to get a replacement part. You can't take the part. You don't want to take the part. And the creative people turned that proposition about the picture's just the beginning into a line that said, "See what develops." And every ad was a story about Polaroid being used as a tool to solve a problem. Until they had the line, "See what develops," it didn't quite work. But she got it so close that you could sort of feel the electricity sparking across the gap. She wrote the first ad.
I love that. I love that analogy of seeing the electricity sparking across the gap.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, I do too.
ironic. It's ironic that in our industry we used Polaroids a lot back in the day, right? Like for casting and
Yeah,
so forth. Like
yeah,
it was a pretty Polaroid, to scout locations, whatever. It was a Polaroid intensive industry. So
yeah. But you did, but I mean, as the phrase you used is the key to it. We used to use them a lot, but they were
yeah,
used. It was for a purpose. It wasn't
yeah,
just for taking
yeah,
snapshots. So it
yeah.
Right, right, right.
but
So,
not
so
always.
John, a young planner comes to you and hands you a brief and says, I think this is a really good brief. I'm very proud of this. I like this. What do you think? What would be the way that you would determine whether that young planner is correct in his or her assessment of her own brief?
Well, I think the first thing, if they said to me, "I think this is a really good brief," I'd probably say to them, "I'm going to tell you the funniest joke you've ever heard." You know, so don't tell me it's a great brief. Let me decide if it's a great brief.
Yeah.
Let me decide
Okay.
if I want to. Let me decide if I want to laugh or not. Um, I well, I I think the great briefs, like the great ideas, have an element of familiarity about them. They make sense based on what I know as a human, as a member of society in California or London or Perth, wherever I'm living. So it makes sense to me, but it makes me think about that brand, that category in a way that hadn't occurred to me before. It's that sort of, "You're so right, but I'd never thought of it that way before" reaction. And a great brief in that sense works in exactly the same way as a great piece of advertising or a great book or a great movie. It just causes you to reassess your relationship with something. So it's got to have enough familiarity to feel true and honest, as you said earlier, but it's got to have an element of surprise and whoa, that's taken me somewhere I wouldn't naturally have gone myself, and that's interesting.
I was talking earlier about Mark Pollard, this traveling, he's like a nomad, and we tried to get him on the show, but he's hard to pin down because he's on the road so much. One of the things that he said that Henry and I didn't get a chance to talk about, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts. He said, and this is related to your answer to this question I just asked. He said, I'm looking for that surprise, and I'm looking for what I would call a pineapple word. There aren't many synonyms to the word pineapple. So if you can find a word like pineapple to describe the problem, describe your audience, state the proposition, that becomes so memorable that the creatives can glom onto it. What's your take on that? Do you like this idea of a kind of a pineapple analogy? What do you think of that as an analogy?
But it's a nice intellectual exercise, but the art. A mistake a lot of people make with briefing is thinking that in the end, the answer comes, you're either right or you're wrong in your proposition. And I think good briefing opens up a lot more opportunities for ideas than necessarily what's written in the proposition. So if I'm writing about the people in the target audience and their relationship with the brand or the category, I might say a couple of things that they're like buried explosive devices, like, and it's up to the creative people whether they walk around them or on them. Ideas can lie in a lot of different places. It may be in the way that you describe these people using media. It may be in what you say sort of strategically around the proposition. So the brief we used to use it was a series of questions, but what's the main idea we're trying to communicate? And then what's the best way of doing that? Like, let's have some ideas about the best way of communicating that idea or getting into people's heads or having them think or act a certain way. Who are we talking to, and what do we know about them that might help us? I worked with creative directors who might say, I don't want to read a document. Just come in and talk to me about the guys who drive these cars. Come in and talk to me about people who buy disability insurance. How does that work? What happens? What are they looking for? And they just sort of sit back and say, well, talk to me about them. And 2 hours later, they might have written one or two notes on a sheet of paper. I don't know what those notes are, but they'll say afterwards, actually, there was one thing you said which made me think of something the client said in the briefing. And if you put those two things together, that's really interesting.
Well, if you're working with a senior level creative, I understand how their ability to synthesize. What I'm worried about is you have what's the word I'm looking for? You have no record. You have nothing that you can point to and say, we agree that this was how we were going to state the problem and how we were going to identify the objective, and what's this unique idea that we're going to try to build this campaign around. There's no record of it, so you might not have the same recollection.
But there's always going to be a record of it, and like through
Well,
that discussion,
I would hope so, but I got the
helps me
sense. I got the sense from your discussion that it was just a conversation between you and a very senior level creative, and that there wasn't a document.
But that's an important part for me of developing the briefing. You know, it's an important part of the briefing for there to be an exchange of information and me to talk about the things that I know and that I've heard from the client, that I discovered on the factory visit, that I felt when I was driving the car, all of those things, and all the little excuse me, anecdotes from people who own the product, anecdotes from people who don't own the product, and why we'll talk about all of that. But I'm looking for that little spark, understanding when something that I mention is interesting to them as creative people.
Well,
because they're coming at it from a different point of view, and I'm just looking to create some energy.
and I think that's I think that's kind of what Mark Poller was getting at with the pineapple words. It's like, how do you make it interesting? Like the first episode we did of the podcast, I think the topic was um, what makes a good brief writer. And I said, well, a good brief writer is a good writer. It's a person that knows how to use words in a way that's evocative, that create a reaction, and it takes time to learn to write. You have to, I think that the good brief writers write well in other environments, in other domains.
Yeah.
And so practicing writing for sure is a big part of it. And then the other thing, as you were talking about that discussion, with a creative director, it's just a reminder to all of us that, this is an organic and iterative process, right? Like where there's a back and forth exchange of ideas, and then that can lead to something else, which leads to something, and it might be torturous, right? Like you might go to the client and fail a couple of times, but through that failure, that back and forth ultimately can lead to something great. And I, the enemy I think of writing and strategy, but in general briefs is, looking at it as a form, right? You don't fill out a
Yeah.
form the same way that you write something, like you would write an essay, the way you would write a short story, the way you would, write a novel. You fill out a form like just the facts, ma'am, and that often doesn't cut when it comes to a brief. So.
No, I think you're absolutely right that if you're talking just about the writing of a brief, um, it has to be written by a good writer. And being a good writer doesn't mean it doesn't equate to being a good business writer, and it doesn't equate to knowing good words and being correct. What we're looking for is, when you're writing a brief, what you're looking for is something that creates energy, and that can only happen through really good writing and really good editing. When I was in running a planning department, I already mentioned the brief we had that was a series of questions, and I did that more for the benefit of less experienced strategists, to keep them on track with the information that they had to provide in the brief. Now, I stopped using that sort of format 20 years ago, and if I'm writing a brief now, I write it as a short prose piece that's just designed to stimulate a conversation and ideas, and it will have all of the elements in it
Mm-hmm.
that used to appear under those questions in my briefing format, but it will be a piece. It's a piece of creative writing that's designed to get into somebody's head and do strange things to them.
It's the difference. It's the difference between a new writer and an experienced writer.
Yeah.
You have absolute confidence in what you're doing and what your objective is, and so you can toss out the format. You can say, I know what it is that I'm trying to convey here, and I don't need to follow a format. I can just write out a piece of prose. So let me use that as a kind of a segue. I don't think we discussed this last time you were with us, John. If we did, forgive me, but
If we did, I won't remember.
Okay, well, yeah, me neither. That's why I'm asking the question. What do you think AI will ever be able to write a brief? What do you think its role is for strategists? How do you use it at all? And what have you discovered about it in your practicing? That's four
I do
questions.
use.
Sorry.
Okay, all right. I'll try. I do use AI, and I use it to help me with. I'm writing, spending most of my when I'm not traveling, I'm writing, and I'm writing a family history, and it's a family history in 4 parts, one for each of my kids' grandparents, like tracing their lines. But I'm writing about the people in our family in the context of the times in which they lived. Now, researching individual chapters would take me 2 months, and this doesn't even include the research I've done to know who these people are. Sometimes on one of our lines going back to the 15th century. Some of the other lines not so much, a couple of 100 years. But researching a chapter, somebody's lifetime, what was going on in British India at the time, what was going on in the world, how did that affect these people, and how did it affect their lives? Because you just for one example, a guy in British India who was an artilleryman, like you can plot his movements in India according to when he came back to Madras and impregnated another woman. Yeah, so all of his children were born about 9 months after he came back to Madras after some military operation. But I knew which military operations he was on based on when he wasn't having children in Madras. So if I go to ChatGPT and give it the right information, it can tell me very quickly and very accurately what operations a particular British Army regiment might have been on, during a particular time period. Like I can in 2 hours accomplish what might have taken me 2 weeks before, just in terms of background research. And then I check all of it, and I cross-check it with other sources and so on. But I don't have to go through all of the original source material. Right. So that's great. It gives me the information I need to get started. I never ask it to write anything for me. That I just couldn't do that, and I wouldn't want to, based on the experiments I've conducted to see what it could write if I asked it. That's not the kind of writing I'm interested in. Now, will ChatGPT ever be able to write strategy and write advertising? Maybe, but I don't think that's the point. I mean, I think it can help strategists and help creative people get to where they need to get, to the area they need to be. But you've got to leave the writing to the humans who are good writers, and you've got to leave the creative thinking to people who are good at having creative ideas. I mean, did I think cars could drive on their own? No, but I just drove in one in San Francisco that did everything for me.
And you're still here to tell the tale.
Well, I'm still here to tell the tale, and it cost me less than an Uber would have cost, and I didn't have to talk to some stinky driver. Like, it was a great experience.
Right.
But listen, this guy called Ken Mandelbaum ran an agency in San Francisco. I don't know what he's doing these days, but at the time when all the agencies were getting excited about this digital thing, he and I were both invited to speak at a digital conference, and I was asked to talk about digital strategy, and he was asked to talk about digital creativity or something. And he made the point that the agencies who were talking the most about digital being the answer to everything, just as agencies today are talking about AI as the answer, and big data was the answer, and programmatic was the answer, and there's the subject du jour that's going to be the answer. And he said, generally the agencies that talk like that they're bad agencies. They're agencies that aren't really doing very well, and they're clinging to this. As if they embrace this, then they're going to be successful, forgetting about all the things that really should matter in advertising. And he said it's a bit like telling a sufferer of amoebic dysentery that the answer is a softer toilet paper. I don't think I'll say any more than that.
Okay, if you had the opportunity, if you ever thought about coming out with a second edition of Truth, Lies, and Advertising, just as hypothetical, what do you suppose you would either change or add? What new chapters do you think you would bring to the book that it might need, or you wanted to talk about?
It's not a hypothetical. I was asked by Wiley, my publisher, to write a second edition, and I declined the opportunity. And they said,
I know you told us that last time, but I'm still just curious to know what you might write.
Well, no, what I wouldn't write anything different. The fundamentals of strategy, the fundamentals of good ideas, in my opinion, haven't changed. The only thing that's changed is agencies' ability and clients' ability to recognize those things and remember them. I just listened to a podcast with Dave Trott, who's an English creative and agency owner.
He was on a podcast?
He did he hates podcasts.
I know, because I reached out to him and I asked him if, and I said, Jon Steel said I should write to you and ask, and he said, I don't do podcasts. Now I'm really disappointed.
Okay, well, I'm sorry to upset you, Howard, but
Somebody,
Dave
for doing one, and he did it.
Yeah, but well, Dave was very clear about why he'd done this. It's a podcast that's done by a fellow called Dave Dye, a creative
Oh,
in the
yeah.
UK. So
He's been on our
Dave,
show.
okay, and Dave Dye asked Dave Trott to come on his show and talk about John Webster. John Webster was the creative director at BMP, the most brilliant, highly awarded creative in the history of British advertising, and somebody who Dave regarded as his mentor. Dave basically says, look, anything I achieved because of the time I spent working with John Webster. Everything useful I learned about this business, I learned from John Webster. And it feels right to me to have the opportunity to talk about him. So I will put aside my prejudices against podcasts, and I'll do it. But actually, what I was going to say is that hearing Dave talk about John was a wonderful reminder of why things work well when they work well in our industry. And it's not that complicated, really not.
I'm so glad that you said that, John, because the longer I have been in this industry as an educator, teaching marketers how to write briefs, the more I've come to realize, and there are going to be people out there who say that I'm a really good teacher and others who say that I really suck and should do something else, and a few in between. But the more I've come to realize, I'm really teaching clear thinking. That's what
Yes.
it comes down to. It's just clear thinking.
Yeah.
It's not about the latest, like you were saying, is it programmatic? Is it digital? No, it's just how do you communicate what really matters to a customer?
Yeah. If you read anything that was written by Howard Gossage, so Gossage, who you're familiar with, had an
Yes.
agency in San Francisco in the 1950s. His agency predated television. If you read what Gossage writes about how to create effective communication and look at some of his work, I mean, he would have been brilliant in the digital age, because
Yeah.
he writes more smartly about how to do good digital advertising than anybody from the digital advertising world I've ever heard from. David Ogilvy, these Bill Bernbach, these pioneers of the modern industry wrote with great clarity about how to engage with people, and everything they said and did was based on the fundamental belief that they existed to create relationships between brands and people. And that's it. That's what we do, and that's what anybody conducting a briefing process has to remember, that
Yeah.
this brief is a tool to enable this brand to have a relationship, or a better relationship, or a stronger relationship with a person in the real world, an individual, and multiply individual by many individuals.
Yeah. Well said. Let's wrap up our conversation, giving you the chance to talk about a wonderful experience that you shared with me in some emails as we were setting up the time for this reunion on the Brief Brothers, about your time in San Francisco and seeing your old friends there. Why don't you tell us about that? What was that like? Who did you get a chance to see? You had a chance to talk to the staff. Tell us about your experience going back to Goodby Silverstein.
Yeah, it had been 12, 13 years since I was in San Francisco. So it was a place that the time I spent in San Francisco was very important to me, both personally and professionally. At the time I worked in the agency, I felt I had the best job in the world for somebody who did what I did. But I always felt a bit like Ringo to John and Paul, who were Jeff and Rich. For me, I was there. I was in the right place at the right time. And I was an okay drummer, but like somehow I became a better drummer when I was with those two. And I think it was an agency where a lot of the people in it were not necessarily the best at their craft, but they all brought out the best in each other. And there was something about the culture of the place that made somebody better when they walked through the door, that heightened, I suppose, heightened their ambitions for what they could achieve, and also heightened their belief in what they were capable of achieving. And it's a very special place and very unusual place in that respect. So I I talked to the staff, and although it was a question session, Jeff interviewed me in front of the staff, so we did that for an hour and a half, and that was quite nice because he was reminding me of things that I hadn't thought about for a very long time, and I'll tell them about such and such. And then I went to lunch with Rich and Jeff and Colin Probert, who was the president for all the time that I was there, and Margaret, who's the creative director, and Leslie Barrett, who's now the president. And it was lovely. And it kind of felt like I last saw them 24 hours ago, you know? It was, no, it sort of made me, it didn't make me want to sort of go back and relive my life, but it reminded me of what I'd most enjoyed about it, intellectually, personally. It was creatively, it was an exciting time. And
I think
just Jeff and Rich are special human beings, you know.
I think being Ringo is not such a bad deal. I mean,
Yeah,
if you
I
saw
wouldn't complain.
if you saw the
It worked for me. It was fine.
Yeah.
if you saw the Let It Be documentary, I mean, of the four, he was at least at that point in the toward the end of the Beatles, he was the most reliable, showed up, did the work, and while everything else was falling apart and the personalities, Ringo was just back there keeping the beat. And so I'm a big admirer of Ringo and actually that document. But it's not a bad place to be, you know, sitting
No,
behind Paul and John and George.
not at
And,
all. And
and Jeff and Rich are very different from each other too. And I mean, they're still exactly the same, but different from each other. And the combination of the two of them works very, very well.
you know, we could go on and continue this conversation. And I really just I thrill at the opportunity to have this chance to pick your brain, John. But we're going to wrap this up, and by saying thank you to Jon Ringo Steel, joining us all the way from Perth, Australia, the author of Truth, Lies, and Advertising, one of the foundational figures and icons in our industry. Thank you, John, for coming back and having this great conversation with Henry and me. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Henry, Howard. All the best, and keep on doing what you're doing.
Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach. Together, we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time, bye bye.